Hello and welcome to Working Historians, a podcast series where we discuss what historians do with their lives. I am Rob Denning, Associate Dean for Liberal Arts for Southern New Hampshire University's online history programs. Today's episode is a recording of another event in the Southern New Hampshire University History Speaker Series, which brings professional historians, students, faculty, and staff together to talk about research projects, new publications, and history-related careers. At this event, Dr. David Valladares discusses his career and his new book, England's Response to Hitler in the 1930s, Empire, Appeasement, and the Cliveden Set, which discusses political and strategic efforts by British aristocrats to support Nazi Germany's rearmament efforts and the annexation of Austria and Czechoslovakia. Let's check it out. Thank you, everybody, for coming out and joining us today for this current, I guess, event in our history speaker series here for Southern New Hampshire University. I am Rob Denning. I'm the Associate Dean of Liberal Arts for SNHU. I oversee the graduate and undergraduate online history programs at SNHU. And I'm really happy to be here talking to Dr. David Valladares. David is an assistant professor of communications at Santa Fe College in the United States. His areas of research include British foreign policy during the interwar period and South African unification. He recently published Tragedy or Betrayal, Interwar Europe and British Appeasement. He earned his doctorate from Florida State University in Modern European History and has other degrees in literature and communications. In addition to his work at Florida State, Dr. Valladares has studied at the University of Florida and St. Catherine's College in Cambridge. He has served on the editorial board for the Southeastern Review and as an editor for the Oxford Handbook of World War II. And he currently serves as a contributor for history reviews of new books and International Journal for Literature and the Arts. And Dr. Valladares also teaches here at SNHU. So it's great to have you. It's great to talk to you. First off, before we get into all your book and all of that, can you tell us a little bit more about your background beyond what I just read off there? How did you enter the history field? What brought you here? How did you get to where you are, basically?
Yeah, thanks, Robert. Like anything else, we tend to be attracted to the things that we find to be interesting. I've always found history to be fascinating. I mean, during my undergraduate at the University of Florida, I actually had the opportunity to double major in both English and history. And I thought they complemented each other pretty well. Literature does a great job, especially if you focus on literary theory, on the way that you use certain lenses of interpretation of any kind of artifact that's in front of you. And history tends to be kind of like the grunt of academics. I mean, there's so much research and work and archival like searching, a little bit like detective work. And it's almost like you get to step into this area of level of understanding and like this almost like lens of interpretation that's just really enjoyable. And I happen to do World War I, Interwar, and World War II. Whenever I talk to someone about my area of focus in history, they're always fascinated because who doesn't want to talk about World War I and World War II? But I remember a lot of us tend to head in this area of study because we had a really formative professor, that we would always be at their office, always talking to, having great conversation. And a lot of the times I tell people that teaching is one of the best kept secrets, especially at the collegiate level, because if it's done correctly, you're having interesting conversation with interesting people. And other than that, I think it's important to stay active in the scholarship. So I do sit on a couple of editorial boards. I'm sure that my students here at Santa Fe benefit from both my focus on not just writing and development and theoretical application, but also having a critical eye for more of the research methodologies that are important when it comes to dealing with any kind of like important content information. When it comes to publication, I always encourage academics to be active with staying on editorial boards, reading other people's work, commenting, contributing, staying engaged within the literature and the conversation that's going on. And being on editorial boards helps you with that. Also, sometimes looked a little down on, but I think it's always beneficial staying active with book reviews. And so if you can be like on a book review board, seeing the newest literature that's coming out from, historians and their work in your area, I think it's great too. So teaching is my first love, research probably after that. And then, of course, being in the editorial publication world is probably the third.
Great, and I think we may come back to a little bit more of your career trajectory and all that kind of along the way, but let's kind of jump into the book here. I
Sure.
just posted a link to the publisher's website for the book in the chat in case anybody wants to kind of check it out while we're talking about it here. But the book that we're talking about is England's response to Hitler in the 1930s, Empire, Appeasement, and the, is it Cliveden set? Cliveden?
Cliveden said.
Clifton, of course. Okay. And so it's I've got a chance to look at it earlier today, and it's a really interesting read. So can you tell us a little bit about kind of intro to the book? Where did the idea for this come from? How did you come to this topic? What is this topic? What do you mean by Cliveden set? Give us some background on the book.
It's really crazy. So, like a lot of times when you're in graduate school trying to get your PhD, you're kind of dealing with the idea of a lot of different barriers that are in the way. One of the biggest one is finding your original contribution to the literature. And so I was getting ready to do my comprehensive exams, and there was a professor at Florida State who was like an institution all in himself. He had been there for like 40 years. And he was a bit of a curmudgeon. You would walk into his office, and if you were interrupting his lunch, he would like be really brief and curt and kick you out. But when I went to go sit down and talk with him, we realized we had a strong appreciation for World War I poetry, whether it's Siegfried Sassoon or Charles Hamilton Sorley. And surprisingly, as to historians, we had some of the poetry memorized, and we were going back and forth. It was this really strange moment. Well, at the end of that conversation, he looked at me. He's like, you know what, Valladares, I like you. He's like, I know you're looking for your topic, and typically it's a big no-no for faculty members to propose topics for students. But if I had another lifetime of research, because he was in his 80s at this point, he's like, I would have done the topic of the Cliveden set. And so we sat down and he told me what the Cliveden set was. And what the Cliveden set was is it was an accusation by a journalist called Claude Coburn, who said that there was this cabal, this elitist cabal, that was actually influencing British foreign policy in favor of Hitler outside the normal like avenues of political process. And so we started talking about it, and I found it, of course, to be interesting. You're talking about secret societies, you're talking about elite groups, you're talking about British Empire, all those kind of things. But what's funny is at the end of that meeting, when I was walking out, he looked at me and it's like, Valladares, you can have this topic, but be careful. I'm like, what do you mean be careful? And so that's what started the topic. And so from there, I kind of like just dived full into it and really kind of like dedicated the past like 8 years in researching it. And that's the product of the book. So that's how the topic came to pass. The process of researching it was actually pretty entertaining. You had to hit a lot of archival resources, but what is attended primarily to the book of the major contribution isn't just the reviewing the Cliveden set itself, but there had to be an expansive way in which you approach the content. Because how do you deal with esoteric societies as a historian? You really can't like have a sentence or a statement in any monograph unless you have a source to support it, unless you have a primary archival point. So the very nature of a esoteric group or secret society is they hide their sources. So what do? And so it was actually a new developed theoretical application by which you can find a pattern of behavior, the political behavior of a specific group in a specific dynamic. And what the book does is it tracks this specific group going from actually starting with Alfred Milner and Cecil Rhodes in South Africa to then hitting a group called Milner's Kindergarten, which actually helped unify South Africa. Because if you know the context of South Africa during the turn of the 20th century, it was broken down into 4 sections. It was broken down into the Orange Free State, the Transvaal, Cape Town, and the Natal. And they were all divided. And what ended up happening is this group, for British interests, were able to unify South Africa. And they found their methods to be very effective in doing so and centralizing power under the influence of Britain. So they grabbed the exact same model and they applied it to India. And then they grabbed the exact same model and applied it to Europe. And this is the move towards Commonwealth. I understand I'm giving a lot of information that people need context on. But the move towards Commonwealth pretty much was aimed by the British during the decline of the British Empire and the British aristocracy to maintain power. And so by looking at South Africa and their methods in South Africa, looking at India and their methods in India, I then apply the exact same methods to Europe during the interwar period, during the promotion of British foreign policy, the central policy, which is appeasement of Hitler. And I directly correlate the appeasement of Hitler to the policies that this group was pushing. So by argument and conclusion, you can say that their efforts to appease Hitler contributed to Germany rearming, which then led to the onslaught of World War II. So I don't lay all fault of World War II at the hands of the Cliveden set. What the monograph does is show their kind of like novice meddling into politics that help aid Hitler in rearming.
That's really interesting. And it's interesting hearing that you kind of have to apply a little bit of a different methodology to it. I mean, it makes perfect sense. I mean, this is a secret society. It's not like the good old days when secret societies used to kind of advertise in local phone books. I'm in Columbus, Ohio, and a year or so ago, I was at the state library looking through old city directories for the city, and there was an entire section labeled secret societies, and it would actually like list which ones they were and when they met and where they met and all of that, which of course doesn't really make it a very secret society. But so you're going with having a much different experience, obviously. And so it's interesting that you're applying this new methodology, or this different methodology, because it's not really a straightforward research like we're used to. So can you tell us anything more about the methodology? Where have you seen it used before? I mean, I know I guess you used a couple of case or specific examples there, but have other historians kind of embraced this form of method?
So that's what's interesting in historiography. Very few people have heard of the Cliveden set. If you look at historiography, a lot of people are dismissive. So what makes the Cliveden set so kind of like interesting is it's established within aristocratic groups. So how the Cliveden used to recruit the people that they wanted to stick in positions to influence, it doesn't matter for South Africa, India, or even England, political movements, was they would wine and dine them. Cliveden is named after the Cliveden estate. It's this very palatial, kind of like ostentatious estate where you had characters who were part of the set called the Astors. You had Nancy Astor and you had Waldorf Astor. Nancy Astor is actually seen within the historiography as this laudable character. She wasn't the first woman elected into British Parliament, but she was the first woman to sit in British Parliament. And she actually was a Virginian. She was an American. And this is during the time when the British Empire was declining, that in order for their aristocracy to survive, they had to almost sell themselves to the nouveau riche of the Americans coming over and like buying peerages and buying titles and buying estates, and all those things were going on. And so the Astors would recruit a lot of political figures and have parties at their estate. And what ends up happening is a lot of well-known historians would look at the registry of the people who are attending these parties and like, there's no way that you can look at the registry of the people attending these Cliveden parties and say that there was some kind of secret underhand movement of some cabal trying to influence British foreign policy. And I would agree. I think that's the main error in the historiography, is to keep the interpretation of what the Cliveden set was doing to the Cliveden estate, especially to one or two figures. What you have to do is, like everything else, is if you're following a line of thinking, is you have to see who influenced what and who was spending time together. That's why I start with groups in South Africa, then connect them to what was called the Round Table movement of creating a Commonwealth in Britain, which is connected to another movement called Chatham House, in which you start to have strong connections between the British kind of like policymakers and America and Canada and South Africa and India, to then you get to almost like the arm of the Cliveden set, which was the wining and dining aspect of it. The biggest thing to focus on as well is the writing of people who were against the policies of appeasing Hitler. That's where you get some of the best information, because when people like the Astors or Viscount Halifax, who was part of the Cliveden set, would reach out to people across the aisle to promote the policy of appeasement, you would have this rejection in their writing, the writings of Churchill, Anthony Eden. And what's really interesting about that, though, is it also contributes to the literature of the political theory of appeasement. Because one of the biggest problems that you have with appeasement is it doesn't matter who the historian is, whether you're dealing with traditionalists, revisionists, counter-revisionists on the topic of appeasement, no one really understands why Chamberlain utilized appeasement for Hitler. You have the argument that he was buying time, that, the industry of the RAF and different things were behind Germany. So in a position of weakness, you use, appeasement, or in a position of, listen, we just had a First World War, the Great War. We want to do everything we can to avoid a Second World War. So, of course, we're appeasing to avoid that. But when you look at the policies themselves, which is highly surprising, is you can't answer why Hitler had a free hand in Central and Eastern Europe. Why was he allowed to annex Czechoslovakia or Austria? I mean, it just doesn't make sense within the policy statement of it. And that's one of the main things that the book considers. Why was Chamberlain's kind of like cabinet for the annexation of Central Europe? And that's one of probably the strongest parts in the monograph is it answers that question. It talks about and talking about like secret groups and meetings. There's an entire section of the book that covers a secret meeting that Viscount Halifax had, who was an extension of Chamberlain's cabinet, actually taking the point of Anthony Eden within the Foreign Office, in which he has this really secret meeting with Hitler. And there's this historian that slips my mind right now that pretty much said one of the biggest kind of like scandals during the interwar period that no one ever mentions in the historical literature is this meeting between Halifax and Hitler, in which it is known because it was stated in Parliament during the minutes that Halifax would give Hitler a free hand in Central Europe if Hitler abandoned his South African colonies, did not have any desire to expand in South Africa. And so you stop for a second and I'm like, wait. In order to give Hitler a free hand in Central Europe, that means that France, England are abandoning their like allies in Central Europe, like Czechoslovakia, like Hungary. So what's the strategical reason there? If you're buying time, why you're allowing Hitler to like not just rearm as well by annexing all the weapons that were in Czechoslovakia to begin with, but also to take these territories? It doesn't make sense unless you're starting to see that they were trying to establish a four-power system in Europe in a response to Russia, which mirrors South Africa, which mirrored their processes in India. Because to this point, I don't think historians have a very clear answer within the historical argument, the real kind of like motivations behind appeasing Hitler. So
That's fascinating. And certainly from a presentist perspective, or from a an after the fact perspective, the idea that appeasing Hitler, everybody kind of agrees. It's like universally agreed that of course you can't appease Hitler. It just seems ridiculous that anybody would even try, because of the things that came afterward. I mean, obviously this is Monday morning quarterbacking, but at the time, that's really interesting that. And so we've got this. So as you're saying, this Clifton set is all about kind of almost a shadow government, I think you call it at one point, or at least a shadow foreign policy apparatus of some kind. So how did that interact with the legit foreign policy apparatus? Because there's certainly you're making connections here between Chamberlain and Halifax, and that he's doing Chamberlain's bidding, but he's basically a private citizen at this point, right? He's not actually an official representative of the government. So how does that play out alongside the official government?
And that's one of the probably the issues, because at the time in the Chamberlain cabinet, Anthony Eden was in charge of the Foreign Office, and Anthony Eden during this, and it's mentioned in the book, during this one meeting at Clifton actually resigns and he leaves because Halifax is sent over. And that's one of the big questions. What authority did Chamberlain have to send Halifax in replacement of Anthony Eden? And there's a complete area of the historical relationship between Eden and Chamberlain in one of the sections. But what's really kind of fascinating about this is the method, which is covered as well. Sometimes it seems a little discombobulated because I'm in South Africa, then I'm in India, then I'm in England. But the theory of following these practices have to be expanded on. For instance, one of the founders of the kindergarten in South Africa, which was the group of young scholars from Oxford, All Souls College, which helped establish this unification in South Africa, was put together and oversaw by someone called Alfred Milner. Milner was very closely connected to Cecil Rhodes. Now, if you look at one of the most prestigious scholarships that are out there, it's the Rhodes Scholars, Rhodes Scholarship, which you get to study in Oxford, graduate level work on scholarship. It was an extension of the Rhodes Trust, the Rhodes Foundation. If you look at Cecil Rhodes' writing, he discusses the need to function outside of government structures. He literally comes up in his writing and says, we need to establish a secret society to be more effective in Britishizing the world, and modernizing it. And his method, he literally says in his writing, is modeled directly after the Jesuits. He even gives the analogy of an onion, that you have this different layering of control when really it's a central group of a few that really know what's controlling the other methods of what's going outside of it. And they realized that, listen, you can't control an area just by military tactics. You just can't. I mean, England's the size. I mean, if you could comparably, it's just a little bigger than New Jersey. How on earth did it have an empire that the sun never set on it? How is that possible with the number of people they had available? Well, they had to fight on other means. And one of the things they would do is, the best example is India during the Urwan Pax, in which Halifax was in charge of the Urwan Pax with Gandhi in like the 1930s. They realized that what they needed to do is they needed to recruit capable, competent locals, Indian locals, and stick them in positions of power. And so what they would do is they would recruit through scholarship over to be studied at Oxford or Cambridge, the Western ideology of modernization, then stick them in a position in India by which they were the ones who were controlling the decision-making process. But of course, it's under the suzerainty and the direction of England. And it was an interesting dynamic, because when England realized that they were losing control of India, it's almost like, I like to give this description of a pie. Imagine if someone's about to take a pie from you by force and by control. What England did was fascinating. They came up to India and like, hey, listen, we recognize you need self-government. We recognize that you need to have the level of independence. So we will let your locals make these decisions. However, since we are protecting you from outside forces that may want to come in and disturb the order that you're establishing for your own kind of like control, we need to have some kind of, like fealty payment, some suzerainty payment. And so the Indian locals like, well, what do you want? Do you want timber? He's like, no, we don't want timber. Do you want like gold and precious metals? No, we don't want that. And they're like, well, what do you want? And they're like, well, we want the British pound sterling. That's what we want. So immediately what it did is it gave value to a currency that the Indians didn't necessarily value to begin with, but since it was representative of their self-rule, it became a valuable commodity. And so in that way, what Britain was able to do was control their financial system. And at any moment, they could depress their economy. This is one of the methods that was established by Alfred Milner in the kindergarten in South Africa. It's just one of the many methods. And so you see that methods within their writing, because they were younger during their practices in South Africa, when they just straight up say, we need to control the currency system here. And then from there, you see the same methods used by the same group in India. Then you see similar methods used in Europe, what they were pushing for at the time. So that's just one example of the methodology of theoretical application that you can see that the book tries to establish.
And the more you describe that, I mean, the more it just occurs to me that this isn't necessarily something that only the British use. I mean, the U.S. is going to use this throughout
Absolutely.
the imperial period after, the 1890s onward. I mean, Central and South America, I mean, that with the Roosevelt corollary and all that, that's basically saying that is that we're going to protect you, but we do expect some things in return, like stability and capital, and maybe not necessarily capitalism, but at least something that's friendly to American businesses, that kind of thing. So this is not just a British imperial thing. This is something that the Americans also embraced. Some of the tactics might have been different, but the strategy is similar.
No, absolutely. And not just within the methods used by the British, but I mean, the idea of control financial systems, especially when it comes to the idea of globalizing, right? Because by unification of South Africa, you have a centralized rule. Unification of India, you have a centralized rule. Unification of Europe, you have a centralized rule. And now you can see some of those same kind of like international monetary applications that were reflective of these earlier usages now being used like America. So if the main goal by the Cliveden set was to establish a reordering of a commonwealth where you had a four-power rule, you had that in South Africa established, you had it in India established, they were trying it in Europe, and then now if you use it more of a global scale contemporarily, the argument would be that you need a geopolitical maneuvering in order to establish a four-power system right now, which could be easily be China, Europe, Russia, and America, which would be the Western world. You're absolutely right. If you look at the world market or world currency, we're hearing the discussion of the nascency development of a CBDC, a centralized digital currency. It wouldn't be surprising if you hear a conversation of a global centralized digital currency. And if that's the case, then you can take it back to the applications in Europe that the Cliveden set were using during the interwar period, back to India during the Urwan Pax, all the way back to South Africa and some of these same methodologies. So it almost seems like, to an extent, a playbook. Now, let me make this point, though, really quick. a lot of this research builds on a historian whose name was Carroll Quigley. He's actually pretty well known. He was a professor at Georgetown. His two most well-known books are The Anglo-American Establishment and Tragedy and Hope. So, reputable historian, Georgetown professor. He was writing back in the 1950s, and he pretty much was the first one to come up with this idea of this movement towards globalization, from Commonwealth to globalization. And he was the one who brought this back to the kindergarten. But his issue is he claimed that the secret group approached him and asked him to organize their primary source content. And he had access to it, but he was not allowed to cite it. And this is a story that you can see within his text. And that's a conundrum for a historian, to make a claim that there's a global movement of centralization, but I can't show you the documents of whatever it may be. But what's interesting is one of the people that Bill Clinton cited as an inspiration for him during his Democratic, the nomination, I think it was 1992, as he directly cites Carroll Quigley, you know. And so part of my research does build on Carroll Quigley's work. It's just trying to show a theoretical pattern of practice in these three geographical zones, which he didn't do. And so this is honestly, if you look at the work, it is a little bit of a supplement to what he already had put together, but trying to give almost like a theoretical application to it instead of some speculation of, a secret group that I saw sources behind closed doors.
I'm glad you mentioned that, because one of the big challenges that students have when they come to the end of their program capstones, whether it's undergrad or the grad level, is the idea that they're going to have to do a major research project that expands what we know about a topic. So it has to build on what's already there. And so it's nice to hear you frame this as you are expanding on someone else's work. You're not replicating someone else's work. You're not reinventing the wheel. You're actually going above and beyond and kind of expanding it in new ways. And that's one of the things that students often struggle with, is because, they want to do a research paper on a fun topic that they like. But oftentimes, me as the professor, as the bad cop, I always have to say, well, what are you adding to our collective knowledge? What are you doing that hasn't been done before? And how are you, what's new about this? And that's a question that a lot of students struggle to answer, is because they're not really used to that way of thinking. They're just thinking, I need to do a bunch of research on this topic and I'll create a research paper. But as historians, it's not we're not here to reconstruct someone else's work. We actually need to do something that is different, do something that is new, whether that's by proposing a new argument, finding a new topic, finding new sources, but you need to do something in a new way. And so I'm glad to hear you say that you're kind of expanding on the work of this kind of previous generation of historians, because that forthrightness, I think, needs to happen for students to kind of understand how the history profession works and what we're actually doing here. We're not just researching sources or topics for the heck of it. We're actually trying to do something new here, and that's great to hear.
Very kind of reductive level, historians do one of three things primarily. Either they're testing a theory, or they're answering a question, or they're filling a gap within the literature. And so a lot of the times, if you have a good monograph, not only will it give you some interesting research information, but it'll tell you the areas of research that need to be expanded on. The idea of saying, hey, listen, this isn't extensive, and it's not meant to be extensive. Of course, there's going to be gaps in here. But for the measure of what's trying to be done, it has to be meaningful, it has to be measurable, it has to be doable. And so that's why a lot of the times, if you see a conclusion of a monograph, it'll give you, if there was more time of research or where the next research is going to go, this is what it would have done. Because your approach can't be exceeded on any topic. I mean, just by shifting the lens. So this monograph has a primarily political, economic, and really kind of like a little bit of a theoretical application when it comes to esoteric groups. But that doesn't mean that there couldn't be a different lens of application. There's no question that, within the book, which ignores pretty significantly, is the cultural impact that some of these policies had in South Africa, India, and England. I mean, that could be an entire different area of research that someone could do. And so a lot of the times there has to be the scope of what the research is trying to do. and you can't always fault it for what it hasn't done yet because of everything has to be manageable within the thesis of what the book's trying to do. So.
Yeah, and so just to kind of start to wrap up the book a little bit here, you mentioned before that they weren't necessarily all that successful. I mean, you can't really quantify a level of success, I suppose, for a secret society like this. But what do you think did they what did they do? What was their lasting contribution to? I mean, what makes this significant looking back so much later after all these years? Is it simply that you've got this kind of group of aristocrats that are kind of trying to influence European matters in exchange for some sort of a colonial arrangement? What's the significance of all this, and why does this group of folks matter?
Well, the reason why it matters primarily is you start to see the reason why appeasement was pushed during the interwar period. It really goes towards, if it's going to contribute primarily to the literature, the established literature, it's going to go back to a counter-revisionist kind of approach. Because if you look at appeasement, the first argument was this kind of like Churchill, guilty men, like Chamberlain, incompetent. He didn't know what he was doing. His whole group should be held accountable to it. Then you had this counter-revisionist movement, this revisionist movement that pretty much like, no, if you do it again, Chamberlain was in a tough position. He was buying time. He was trying to promote the best interest for England to avoid a Second World War. Okay. But then the counter-revisionists, like where my book falls into it, comes in like, no, there are other influence behind Chamberlain than just Chamberlain's policy. What was the real function behind it? What were the influencer and the friends or the processes that Chamberlain used in order to promote a sense of appeasement? Who else was promoting appeasement? Well, there was this group called the Cliveden set that was very much aggressive in promoting appeasement. Well, what level of influence did they have over Chamberlain? Well, who was in this group? What other places were their progenitors of where they came from? And so that's where the historical question really starts. And I think it's important because, right now we're having a great deal of like geopolitical tension right now. Russia with Ukraine, China with Taiwan. And right now, I think the next political discussion with Russia and Ukraine is whether or not Russia will be able to maintain the land that they've, expanded in Ukraine. And so if they do consider that from a Western point of view, that's an appeasement question, And so even contemporarily, it's an interesting question of whether or not if you have an aggressor, if appeasement as a foreign policy application should be utilized well. And it's a big question during the interwar period. And so this was just one of those areas of study of asking the question, why the interwar British policy of appeasement? Why did Chamberlain apply it? What were some of the influences that helped push that point? And one of those areas of study, or one of those figures in the shadows, was the Cliveden set.
Yeah, and I feel like this book, another contribution that this book makes is kind of shining the light on this group of folks. I mean, today we'd probably call these folks like oligarchs, like they always talk about like the oligarchy in Russia or wherever like that. You've got kind of the behind the scenes upper class folks that are kind of guiding policy in an unofficial fashion. And I think this is an interesting way to kind of demonstrate that in a different context, in a different environment. You maybe can't quantify their success, like I said, but you can at least show that there is this group of folks that are trying to exert influence for specific reasons. I think that's valuable just on its own also.
Yeah. And once again, it's just, sorry, go ahead.
I was going to move on to Richard's question, but no, go ahead.
No, and so that's what it is. A lot of times this is just one of those areas, almost like a piece to add to the mosaic of British interwar British foreign policy. It's just one of those things to consider. There's only been one other real kind of like monograph that's been done on the Cliveden set. It was by Norman Rose, and it was more focused on the grandeur of the Cliveden estate and who these people were and what were their backgrounds and like what was the dynamic. Had nothing to do with their influence within either in foreign policy or their connection to Milner's kindergarten or to the Round Table movement or anything like that. And so what this pretty much does is expand this area of interpretation further, which when you see a gap in the literature, you're going to try to fill it in. So it's not by any means one of the central or most salient points when it comes to appeasement and war policy, but it's one of those that was underdeveloped.
And before I go on to some of the questions in the chat here, just kind of, I'm curious what your thoughts were from the research angle on all of this, because, like you've said, there's no smoking guns. There's very little, correspondence, or very few people wrote things down about, hey, I'm going to help, guide unofficial foreign policy in Europe. So, as a researcher, how did that change the way that you operate? I know that you kind of had to adopt this method, this kind of larger methodology model to kind of pursue it, but kind of in the day-to-day operations of doing research, how did that affect the way you would do this compared to any other research project?
So, I mean, right, that's a good question. It had to be a little bit more geographically expansive to begin with. So a lot of times, if this was any other like focus, not on the Clifton set or Milner's kindergarten, if I was doing South African unification, a lot of times it's very focused on like developments in South Africa. I mean, we've seen the move in history of bringing in other areas. Like if you study Atlantic world, it's the interaction in the kind of like expansion of different cultures, different groups, and what came from that. So you have to be a little bit more world versed. With this one, it was almost kind of like extending or following the pathway that was provided by the members. And so it's really interesting to focus primarily on like individual correspondences, diary entries. I mean, I read the personal letters of Halifax, of Chamberlain, of Nancy Astor, because of so much of this, if you look at it, the concept of I guess even if it's a stringent word, cabal, isn't necessarily a formal conspiracy. It's not like these people sat back and like, I need to have a formal conspiracy of moving outside to undermine government political structures and movements. No, I mean, you have just interests aligning with these people of the aristocratic groups of preserving, which was the main motivation, preserving the British Empire and the British aristocracy, which was on distinct decline. And so the response was a Commonwealth. And so how do you make movements towards those policies of Commonwealth? Well, if you discuss maybe the idea of creating equal treatment and equal policy with South Africa, India, and England, well, the denizens of England aren't going to be very happy with that. They would prefer to have like this, kind of like England first kind of motivation or movement. And so in order to understand the responses within the political decisions of Halifax, of Chamberlain, of Lord Lothian, of Lionel Curtis, all these people that were very active within these political movements, you have to see the geographical move of application from South Africa, India, and England. So that's what makes this a little bit different. To build an argument, it's almost like that same theoretical application, just in different geographical locations.
So you mentioned earlier that your book wasn't really focusing on the cultural angle of it so much, but I'm curious, based on what you have seen, based on, because I know that you looked at some newspapers and you were talking about journalists who were trying to kind of crack the story a little bit. What was the popular response to this Clifton set? And, there's because word did get out. You mentioned the journalist Colson, something like that kind of broke the news and started writing stories about it. But I'm curious, what was, how did people respond to this? And did it really change the course of anything? Did that contribute to any reversals, or did it just solidify the strategy? What was the effect of people hearing about this?
It was incendiary. It shot all over the world, this idea that there was this aristocratic group that was actually serving, and the term was Hitler's fifth column in England. The concept of a fifth column is that inside kind of like almost like the spy ring of information that was giving Hitler content. And so they were actually branded as fascists. They were branded as Nazis. I mean, Chamberlain pretty much died in disgrace. Halifax's career was pretty much over. The Astors had this cloud of kind of like this fascist branding on them. And it's one of the misconceptions the monograph tries to address. The Clifton set was not fascist. They were not Nazis. They were actually just pro-British Empire, and they thought they could work with Hitler. That's what they thought that they could do. There was, if you look just from a military strategic point of view, Germany was needed throughout history, it's always been needed as a buffer to Russia, as a buffer to Eastern Europe, and they needed a strong buffer there. So it wasn't that they were pro-Hitler. If anything, Nancy Astor was actually very highly critical of Hitler. She made fun of his mustache, saying, "Who do you think he is, Charlie Chaplin?" And so it's not that they liked Hitler; they just were wondering if Hitler could be worked with. And if so, then maybe if he could, and that was the meeting with Halifax, trying to figure and suss that out outside governmental avenues, then they can support Hitler when it came to their policies. This actually leads into the next monograph I've been currently working on, which is actually not extending the research in the Cliveden set. It actually has to do with the concept of a fifth column. And what I do in the current monograph I'm working on is actually reviewing some of the accusations of people in England that were accused of fascism. The Cliveden set, of course, that's done. There was another group called the Fellowship, who was another elite group of men that wanted to wine and dine the Nazis into what they would consider to be kind of like not just modernity, but also into the modern gentleman type. And they would go meet with Hitler all the time and try to spread British culture. Edward VIII, who was accused of being a fascist sympathizer. If you've ever seen the movie Remains of the Day, he's one of those characters in there that's considered to be the aristocratic support of fascism and Hitler. Another group that I focus on a person is Oswald Mosley, who was a fascist in England, or the Mitford sisters who were in love with Hitler. And the reason why it's the focus is because there's a lot of conversation on whether or not the Cliveden set were fascists, and they weren't. They were just pro-British Empire. They wanted to restore the British Empire, and they saw the typical parliamentary system as being ineffective in stopping that decline. And so their engagement in it had nothing to do with being a fan of Hitler, had more to do with thinking that their only option that worked in South Africa, that worked in India, then needed to be applied in England. And Hitler was part of that equation because he was the one who was, in the leadership in Germany at the time.
That sounds like it's going to be a really cool project. I'm looking forward to that one.
Yeah.
We'll let me know when that's published, and we'll get back together and we'll talk about that one.
That's great to me.
So let's shift here a little bit. Let's move to questions from the audience. If folks in the audience, if you want to start thinking of some questions while you're doing that, Richard has posed a question. Says, so Europe was okay with giving everything up as long as Hitler left South Africa alone? Am I understanding that correctly, or did I misunderstand?
No, they weren't. Europe was not. Actually, one of the movements away from the Versailles Treaty, which this group considered to be monstrously punitive, is that's one of the reasons why they had to function outside of governmental lines, because there was a lot of pushback away from it. There's a lot of people who weren't into rearming Germany or to making these negotiations. I mean, it's absolutely scandalous to say that Hitler was going to be given, and this is the line that's talked about, that's delivered in Parliament, a free hand in Central Europe. I mean, that's abandoning your allies, The Anschluss, there was a lot of pushback against that. Why did the Cliveden set think that South Africa was so important? Is because they always did. South Africa, they saw was the roadway to India. And even on the advent of moving into World War I, it was one of the primary reasons why there was so much conflict with Germany and Britain in South Africa, was to preserve their line to India. No, the reason why there had to be a sense of surreptitiousness is because, the typical line of almost kind of like political argument was not to abandon Central Europe and was not to promote appeasement with Hitler. So, especially for a trade for Central Europe for South Africa. So, no, it wasn't very popular. That's why it was done very secretively.
So just to be clear, your book is basically the story of a very small group of people who had a very unpopular set of ideas. Again, as you said, their goal was to strengthen the British Empire, which I'm sure is something that most British citizens would be very happy about. And they want, everybody that profits from the empire, of course, wants it to prosper. But arming Hitler and all of that is probably, at least in a short-term thing, is very unpopular. And so this group of folks that you're talking about they were influential, at least to a certain extent, for maybe we should say a short amount of time, but they were very quickly kind of overwhelmed because that was not a very popular opinion, and they got shot down from pretty much every angle, I suppose.
Sure, and one of the chapters actually focused on the way that they were able to garner power and positions of power. It actually goes through the period during the interwar period of the influential seats and areas that they held and how they were able to expand it pretty significantly. But once again, we know the idea of the historian's fallacy. sometimes looking back and having a contemporary lens of what occurred and then criticizing the decisions that were making at the time. During the interwar period, no one had the idea of the to the extent of how vilified and how kind of like a terrible fascism would be, or the crimes that they would commit, like during the Holocaust. Soon after that information came out, everyone tried to abandon their position or hide their position that had anything to do with their support of fascism or support of Hitler. They Cliveden said because of Claude Coburn and publicizing it pretty well in his newspaper, it pretty much stuck with them. And so they, like I said, their reputations were pretty much destroyed at the time. They really never were able to recoup from it. So once you get the branding after World War II of being a fascist sympathizer, it was hard to get that smudge off.
Yeah, I'm sure, especially as images of the Holocaust and all that kind of become known. I'm sure that became a very difficult position to be in. And so,
Sure.
yeah, I can see that. Let's see. Richard also asked, don't we have a history of appeasement to end war, as in the whole of history? So you mentioned that appeasement was an unpopular thing, but at the same time, I don't know if you have anything to say for Richard about appeasement as kind of a broader strategy throughout human history.
Appeasement as a strategy is completely viable. It was very unpopular after World War II. Once you started to criticize the Chamberlain cabinet, that's when appeasement became a dirty word. Appeasement is just a diplomatic tool, and so the question of when it's applied and how it should be applied, that's what the historians do. That's what the political scientists do, in a given situation. But no, right after World War II, appeasement was a dirty word. No one wanted to say that they were appeasing Hitler. I would say contemporarily now, appeasement I don't think has the same kind of at all negative connotation that it would have following World War II. But no, appeasement it's a diplomatic utilization with any nation's arsenal to be utilized for, the benefit of avoiding war. Sure. So in my own nomenclature, I don't consider appeasement to be something that's a negative connotation to it, but it did immediately after World War II.
I mean, it feels to me like it's another name for negotiation. I mean, you're trying to make someone else happy so that they don't do something nasty while also getting something out of it. That's basic diplomacy. That's kind of the whole point of it. And so, yeah, like looking back later, you can make the judgment call, like you say, that historians will make after the fact to say that, oh, that was bad. And so let's kind of tarnish it with this. We'll just use this word appeasement, which sounds bad. But, in the time it was happening, people saw this as a legit negotiation. It's all a negotiation, and so hopefully it'll turn out for the best. But yeah, if it turns out, if it doesn't go well, you might get tarnished with something later. But it feels like it's just negotiation. Another word for it. I see that Ian is asking, do you believe the modern day Western policy of we do not negotiate with terrorists was developed as a refutation of appeasement style negotiations in World War II? Interesting question.
It is a really interesting question. My immediate reaction to it is typically appeasement as a sense of foreign policy is put into place with in response to nation and proper forms of, I would say, diplomatic communication, right? The very nature and idea of terrorism is that you're operating outside of those lines. I guess you could have a conversation of whether or not a certain group or a certain nation can be branded as terrorist and whether or not appeasement would be a beneficial kind of like policy. A lot of the times, though, I think, or I would interpret the idea of we do not negotiate with terrorists is usually put into place to excuse the methods by which the opposition is going to be treated. So if there's going to be any use of military force or kind of like strong arming, usually that's going to be the excuse for why other means and methods weren't utilized. So, but that's just my initial immediate reaction to that question.
Yeah, I think you've got an interesting point about it being that there's the different. You're not negotiating between nations. You're negotiating between a criminal organization basically and a nation, and that's a very different dynamic. So I agree that that's the analogy is not perfect, but there is, from an attitude perspective, I think you could still kind of put it out there. Thinking back to World War II, it sounds like there was a popular attitude that we shouldn't be negotiating with Hitler. But the classification of Hitler or the comparison of Hitler to terrorist is, I think it's complicated. It's an interesting question.
Yeah, sure.
Letty is asking, does your next project have to use the same sort of research methods where your sources are more secret?
No, I don't think so. Especially when you're starting to ask the question of fascism development in England or any other place. I don't think there's. I mean, I think there's a solid literature out there. The next monograph actually isn't necessarily aimed towards just creating a historical argument. It's more of addressing certain misconceptions, I think. And so in the literature, I just finished reading a book called Coffee with Hitler and doing a book review on it. It had to do with the fellowship, these group of guys who went and would meet with Hitler and kind of like have scotch and drinks and meals and trying to socialize that way. And they were branded after the war as fascist sympathizers. And so the book Coffee with Hitler he's trying to say, no, they weren't fascist sympathizers. They were really trying to help establish diplomacy between England and Germany. That was the argument. And so what it made me think of is like, well, same thing with the Cliveden set. There's this accusation that there were fascist sympathizers and not a lot of people respond to that. Or when it comes to the Mitford sisters or Oswald Mosley, who were fascist sympathizers, it would be good to have almost like a book that actually reviews the concept of what a fifth column is and how it would be defined. So a lot of it has to do with almost like using these different people during that period as examples, falling within the definition of what a fifth column is. And so there's not going to be too much concern of applying the same methodology that was used for the English response to Hitler monograph. But what it is to almost like build a case to define what we could consider to be actual fascist sympathizers. And I think it's kind of important. We're having that conversation contemporarily now. I mean, even in the Western world, like, what is fascism? I mean, when you compare someone to Hitler or call them a Nazi, what really is? I mean, there are groups and movements in the Western world that directly reflect fascistic kind of like processes. And then there are others that are accused of that aren't. So the idea of the book is to provide a level of clarity of, listen, here's the historical literature on fascism. Here's how it would have applied to the accusations that were made of the people and the members in the groups during the interwar period of what is and is not viable as a fascistic kind of like influence, And so that was the idea behind the monograph. So I won't have to use the same methodological theoretical approach that was done for this book for this new one.
That's very timely because we just got out of an election season where everybody was throwing around the word fascism every day, and so it's interesting to hear to know that you're going to be looking into a kind of a more in-depth analysis of what is fascism, what's not fascism, and how is it represented in different ways. So that's that is going to be an interesting component to that book. Another question here: do you believe the fifth column is using fascism in the world today, and what do you think is the cause and/or reason why?
Going back to the concept of fifth column, I think it's pretty important because the accusation of like Russian interference in elections, Russian influence on politicians, that's been actually thrown about within the political dialogue. I mean, most recently, Tulsi Gabbard was accused of being a Russian asset. That's the concept of a fifth column. You know what I mean? The idea of people in politics, and once again, I'm not giving viability at all to the accusation. I'm just saying the accusation itself goes to this topic. The idea that there are people in the United States or within the Western kind of like culture that's actually functioning for the interests of some other nation. It is part of the national dialogue right now. And so to provide a clarity, almost like a historical description of accuracy of what that actually means, I think will be beneficial. If you go to the typical layman person, or maybe even some historians, they were like, the concept of a fifth column. At first, originally the concept during the Spanish Civil War, not initially the idea, but the verbalization of a fifth column. And so to know its context, know its application, then know its interpretation is one of the things that we historians try to do, this best we can, to give context, to give research, to give referential points so people can come and read it. For this book, England's Response to Hitler, since I was dealing with secret societies and the accusation of a cabal, I researched the heck out of it. I mean, there's over around 700 citations to it. I cited everything. I brought so much information in. I tell my mom, and I'm not trying to kill the book if anyone has interest in it. I'm like, listen, if you have insomnia and want to go to bed, read that book because it's so research intensive. Because if you're dealing with something esoteric and you're trying to be a historian, it better be research intensive. For this next monograph that's coming out, it's meant to be more of a kind of like accessible history. It's supposed to be more of a public history where people can go to Barnes and Noble, pull it off the shelf, and have a interactive understanding of the topic. And so I think that's intended to historians whenever we're doing a new project. What's the scope of it? What do we want to do? Who's the audience? How do you want to make it accessible to them? Whatever it may be. Writing for the Ivory Tower is great, but I think historians are getting tired of journalists winning the Pulitzer Prize in history. And so I think we're trying to change about the way that we make our research not just understandable, but also kind of enjoyable and engaging. And so I do think there's a shift within the narrative and the writing of the Ivory Tower mentality to then almost like the layman's kind of enjoyable conversation. Like I said at the beginning of when we were talking, the best part of teaching is having interesting conversations with interesting people. And so I'm starting to now focus when it comes to my writing and my production to have an interesting topic of research that interesting people would like to engage and have a conversation about.
Yeah, that's great. I've been interested lately in going back and reading a bunch of books published in the 50s and 60s by people like, Sam Hayes and Hofstadter, and they were written in a much different style than a lot of the academic history of today. And those are the historians that did win Pulitzer Prizes and all of that. And so I hope that we are kind of going back to that type of literature because it's much more accessible. I don't think you're giving yourself quite enough credit. I like your book. I think it's it's got it does go through kind of the theoretical rigmarole of historiography and all of that, but we're still talking about kind of this secretive set of people that are doing nefarious things, behind the scenes and all of that. And so I think you've got a good balance there between the two. And so I think this is more readable than you might joke. But so I'll recommend it to everyone out there to take a look at it. I posted the link earlier in the chat. Thank you, David, for joining us. I would like to invite, and I thank everybody in the audience for coming to join us. I would invite you all to come back on January 16th at 1 p.m. for our next history speaker event, where Jose Ernesto Peleas will be talking about his transition from the graduate program, the online graduate program in history at SNHU, to an in-person PhD program at another university. We hear often questions from students about what does it look like for SNHU students to move on to PhD programs? And he's the guy to ask. He's made that transition, and so I hope he's going to have a lot of interesting things to say. So we will send out the registration link for that over the next few weeks. So I welcome everybody to come back for that. And that is about it for today. So again, thank you, David, for coming, and thank you for everyone in the crowd.
Thank you so much. Thank you for the opportunity. I enjoyed the conversation.
And thank you all for listening. If you have any questions or comments about this podcast or any of our other podcasts, please write to workinghistorians@gmail.com. This episode appears on the Working Historians podcast feed, and you can subscribe to that feed on any podcast app, including Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, Podbean, Amazon Music, Pandora, or whatever else you prefer. That way you won't miss any episodes, and you'll continue to hear about all the other cool stuff that historians do with their lives. As always, this podcast does not represent the views of Southern New Hampshire University. For David Valladares, I'm Rob Denning. Be good to yourselves and each other.